This war, the word they use over and over and over again, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Hillary Clinton, all of them, unprovoked. Vladimir Putin led an unprovoked war in Ukraine.
After trying to take over the continent for the second time in 25 years, and this time committing genocide along the way, Germany had earned itself some much-needed time in the penalty box. As I assume most of you know, after the Second World War, Germany was partitioned into 4 separate zones. 3 of these zones were under the control of the Allied powers, France, Britain, and the United States, while 1 was under the control of the Soviet Union. The 3 Allied zones formed the Federal Republic of Germany, commonly known as West Germany, whereas the Soviet-controlled section formed the German Democratic Republic, otherwise known as East Germany. East Germany contained the capital, Berlin, which was partitioned into 2 areas as well. What followed was one of the great natural experiments in human history. One country, with people who had the same background and culture, split into 2, with very different institutions. West Germany had a relatively free market and was governed democratically, whereas East Germany was an authoritarian state with a centrally planned economy. And what were the results of this experiment? Well, I'll put it this way. The brain drain that East Germany and East Berlin experienced was so bad, they had to erect walls to keep people from leaving. From 1961 to 1989, over 100,000 people risked life and limb to make it past the Berlin Wall. Some were successful, though thousands were arrested and over 100 died in the process. On November 9th, 1989, people on both sides of the Berlin Wall gathered around and started to tear it down. We look back at this as a moment of triumph, though it was incredibly risky at the time. Popular uprisings in the Eastern Bloc countries had been smashed with Soviet power in the past. In 1956, the Soviet army marched into Hungary to smash a popular uprising. In 1968, the Red Army was called into Czechoslovakia for the same reason. In 1980, the Soviet army likely would have done the same thing to stop the Solidarity movement in Poland. Except Polish General Wojciech Jaruzelski imposed martial law on the country. Much to his credit, Mikhail Gorbachev, the president of the Soviet Union in 1989, refused to crush the protests in East Germany as they spread throughout the country. On a December night in Dresden, 24 protesters surrounded the local KGB office. The officers called for help from Moscow, only to get no answer. Moscow was silent, the officers heard, just like it had been the night the Berlin Wall fell. So the officers started to burn documents and ward off the protesters themselves. The head KGB officer in that building later wrote of the folly he believes Moscow committed here. We would have avoided a lot of the problems if the Soviet Union had not made such a hasty exit from Eastern Europe. Only one thing works in such circumstances: to go on the offensive. You must hit first and hit so hard that your opponent will not rise to his feet. The officer who wrote that was Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Putin. Last video I responded to Dave Smith's appearance on Joe Rogan, where Smith discussed the reasons Russia invaded Ukraine. I addressed the talking point that the United States promised Russia that NATO would not expand further east. Feel free to watch that if you like, but it's not necessary for this video. Today, I want to talk about whether NATO expansion itself was a provocative action. I bring up Putin's experience in Dresden because it encapsulates 2 important things that still remain true today about how threats, real or perceived, are dealt with in Putin's Russia. The mentality is that the best defense is a good offense, and that lands beyond Russia's official borders are vital to its national security. Those who claim that NATO's expansion was provocative and ultimately forced Putin's hand love to reference this lecture by the political scientist John Mearsheimer, titled, "Why is Ukraine the West's Fault?" Mearsheimer is as credentialed as anyone making the Russia was provoked argument. If you argue with someone on Twitter about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they will likely link this lecture as if it's some trump card. The thing about Mearsheimer that you should understand is that he's a realist when it comes to foreign policy. What does that mean? Well, as Gerald Told explains in Near Abroad, Putin, the West, and the contest over Ukraine and the Caucasus, Mearsheimer identifies 3 core beliefs of political realism. 1, that states are the principal actors in world affairs. 2, that the behavior of great powers is influenced mainly by their external environment, not their internal regime type. And 3, that calculations about power dominate state thinking. Mearsheimer's own version of political realism rests on 5 assumptions that recall the social Darwinian assumptions of classic geopolitics. These are that the international system is anarchic, that great powers inherently possess offensive military capability, that states can never fully trust each other, that survival is the primary goal of great powers, and finally, that great powers are rational actors. They are aware of their external environment, and they think strategically about how to survive in it. Given Mearsheimer's assumptions, Russia was just acting in its rational self-interest by invading their neighbor, since Ukraine was on a trajectory that was at odds with those interests. Hence, the fault lies in those who helped push Ukraine along that trajectory, the West. Told isn't actually referencing the lecture, but a piece in Foreign Affairs by the same title, which Mearsheimer wrote, upon which his lecture is based. As I've said before about Mearsheimer, while I disagree with him, I acknowledge his expertise and take him seriously on this matter. I would not say the same for people like Dave Smith. I'll also say this for Mearsheimer. At least he has the courage of conviction to say what he really means. He thinks that this is the West's fault and is willing to plainly say so. That's more than I can say for Dave Smith or anyone else in the Putin shouldn't have invaded, but crowd. And make no mistake, despite their hedging, shifting blame is exactly what these people are doing.
And if you listen to Vladimir Putin and what he's saying, I mean, look, he's wrong for invading Ukraine. And I mean, you know me, Joe, I'm the most anti-war person there is, and there's no excuse for that. And like tens of thousands of people have died. It's horrible. And a lot of them are soldiers, but a lot of them are civilians. And but to say he was unprovoked is like insane.
These same people love to point out the hypocrisy of their detractors when it comes to Ukraine. And they do have a point. There are a lot of people with Ukrainian flags in their Twitter bios who talk a big game about the importance of democracy and sovereignty, and the tragedy of human rights violations and violations of territorial integrity, who will also ignore or make excuses for similar violations by the United States or some country that America is friendly with. What they fail to consider is that the contradictions and hypocrisies cut the other way, too. When critiquing American foreign policy, these people love to talk about human rights and abuses of sovereignty. Most will make nods to democracy and self-determination. Yet when it comes to Russia, or other countries that are enemies with the United States, they all of a sudden forget these liberal values and adopt Mearsheimer-esque realist assumptions regarding foreign policy.
It's just only people who know nothing about the history of this conflict would say there was no provocation.
Did you see the conversation that Roger Waters had with that CNN guy?
Yeah, and right, because Roger Waters was awesome on that. Because he knows what he's talking about, dude. And he's right about all of that shit.
He's referring to Roger Waters' interview with Michael Smerconish, where Waters makes the standard, this whole thing is actually America's fault case. Sure, Putin shouldn't have invaded, but you tugged on Superman's cape. What did you think was going to happen? Here's a great example. Let's listen to Dave Smith talk about a different situation. Yemen.
The Saudis and the UAE are really launching the war. But it's always, I mean, it's the Saudis doing it, but with American weapons. For the first, several years of the war, we were literally refueling their fighter pilots as they were doing it. And they're conducting the war in the most brutal, egregious way. I mean, they're bombing they're bombing farms, and they're bombing, and they put a full blockade around the country. So there was something at one point, there was in the ballpark of 1 million cases of cholera. I'm not sure if they were actually all cholera or there were some other similar infections that were, but it's been hundreds of thousands of people who have died in this war. The UN said it was the #1 humanitarian crisis in the world, and these are infectious diseases that are targeting or that disproportionately hit babies. I mean, there's babies dying. And Yemen, by the way, before all of this, was the poorest country in the Middle East.
What's happening in Yemen is surely a tragedy, and I'm glad to see that Joe Biden is at least starting to reconsider our relationship with Saudi Arabia. What if we were to apply Mearsheimer's realism to this conflict, the way so many do with Ukraine? Well, then this whole thing is actually Iran's fault, and the United States is perfectly within its rights to support the Saudis. Smith mentioned that there was a Western-led coup in Ukraine.
In 2014, there was a coup in Ukraine that was completely led by the West.
That's not even true, though that's something that needs to be explored in its own right. And I don't want to get too sidetracked here, so I'll just play this clip from Dylan Burns' interview with Anastasia Pereskavova, a Ukrainian woman who took part in the Euromaidan protests.
So, I have not received my payment, or at least cookies from Obama still. It's been 8 years, I'm still waiting. Please, Barack Obama just give me my cookies. I really waiting on them still. So I had not been paid. What's wrong? Well, jokes aside, no one was paid pretty much. I never seen it. I've been every day in Maidan, so I never saw it with my eyes. I don't know a single person in Ukraine who can confirm that they were paid by some kind of like Western something, like America or something. No one talked about America. It's not about America and Russia. It's about Ukraine and Russia. This conflict between Ukrainians and Russians and Ukrainian struggle for freedom against Russian oppression, imperialism, started before United States existed.
Back to Yemen. The former president of Yemen, Abdrabbuh Mansur Hadi, I'm sure I pronounced that wrong, who was far friendlier with the US and the Saudis than the current regime, was ousted in an actual coup by the Houthi movement. The Houthis are an anti-American, anti-Israel Islamist group that has Iran's backing. Given that Yemen is Saudi Arabia's neighbor, and Iran is Saudi Arabia's sworn enemy and a regional rival, Saudi Arabia does have national security interest here. Surely they're going to react to Iran arming Houthi rebels. And yes, this is also in America's security interests. Obviously, Saudi Arabia is an important partner in the region, and like I said earlier, the Houthis are no fan of the United States or our ally Israel. But here's another reason.
That we made this deal with Saudi Arabia in the 70s where they would only trade oil for dollars, which in some ways kind of replaced the gold standard. Like, look, dollars aren't redeemable for gold anymore, but they are redeemable for oil. And so you got some commodity kind of behind the money. And that allows us to print as much money as we want to without suffering the consequences of it quite as drastically, because there's still some value to the money for other people. We can export our dollar around the world.
Yes, Saudi Arabia agreed to trade oil in US dollars, which is important to all oil being bought and sold in dollars. The petrodollar is extremely important to the dollar being the world's reserve currency. The dollar being the world's reserve currency is extremely important to America's economic hegemony, and America's economic hegemony funds its military hegemony. So look, I'm not saying that the US should be backing Saudi Arabia while they commit human rights abuses in Yemen. I'm just saying that we kind of sort of have to, and that the whole thing is actually Iran's fault. That's realism. And if that sounds monstrous to you, I'm glad to hear it, and I suggest not being a realist when it comes to Russia. You need to choose what your priorities are and apply an equal standard. Do things like human rights matter, or are state interests the priority? Why should Russia be held to a lower standard than the United States? Now, it's definitely true that Russia views Ukraine's affairs as being part of their business. The two countries, of course, share a border, so Russia views Ukraine as being in a zone of privileged interest. Or they're near abroad, as the Russians call it. As Putin said 2 days before the invasion, Kyiv has long proclaimed a strategic course on joining NATO. Indeed, each country is entitled to pick its own security system and enter into military alliances. There would be no problem with that, if it were not for one but. International documents expressly stipulate the principle of equal and indivisible security, which includes obligations not to strengthen one's own security at the expense of the security of other states. So, rightly or wrongly, Russia views Ukraine's interests and decisions as closely tied to their own. Therefore, even if Ukraine joining an alliance with Russia's enemies isn't meant as a threat, that doesn't mean that it won't be perceived as such. And again, Russia is hardly unique among large countries in viewing their smaller neighbors as being part of a zone of privileged interest. But how big is Russia's near abroad, exactly? Here's Peter Zion laying out the scope of what Russia thinks it's entitled to.
And when you look at what Russia threatened NATO with just before he launched the war, he listed all the countries that he wanted to be able to write their security policies and make sure that no NATO forces were ever in them ever. Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Moldova, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, Hungary, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Sweden. So you would have to give the Russians de facto control over the lives and security policy of a total population that is double that of all of Russians combined. So from a certain point of view, yeah, he's right, but that's still utter, unmitigated horseshit. We will never abide by that, and neither would any of the countries in between.
If we just give Putin dominion over the national security over all these countries, he wouldn't have invaded his neighbor. Perfectly reasonable, right? Even if you think large nations should have zones of privileged interest, which I don't, This isn't a reasonable position. The first person who I ever criticized on this topic was Kyle Kulinski. Here's something he said recently about this invasion.
NATO encroachment, yes, I used to think that was, if not the only reason for Russian aggression, I thought it was maybe the predominant reason. That like the majority reason why they're doing what they're doing is because they feel existentially threatened by NATO encroachment. Now, having watched the war unfold, having seen the actions that Putin has taken, and I think more importantly, just listen to his own words in his speech when he announced the invasion, I'm now of the belief that I think he would have done this anyway, even if NATO never expanded. But I don't think NATO should have expanded in the first place because I don't want to give him an excuse. I don't want to give him something he could point to say, well, actually, that's the reason. Because really, it's propaganda.
Mr. Kulinski might finally be piecing this whole thing together. Putin did not want Ukraine to join NATO. We know that. But there's evidence to suggest that it may not have been the deciding factor in this invasion. For starters, Ukraine wasn't even in the Membership Action Plan program, which is a precursor to most countries joining NATO. Membership Action Plans take a long time to implement. Consider that Northern Macedonia was in the program for 21 years before they joined NATO. And even so, entering the program is no guarantee of membership. Sweden and Finland, two countries that are such good candidates for NATO that the MAP program wasn't even deemed necessary for their entry, may not even get in, as Turkey may be the lone holdout. The bigger NATO gets, the more difficult it is to add new countries. You need every single country that's a member to approve a new member, and every country's vote counts the same. In 2008, when Ukraine and Georgia were turned down for membership action plans at the Bucharest summit, NATO members did agree to release a statement saying Ukraine and Georgia will become NATO members. If you don't understand how empty of a gesture this is, consider that later that year, Russia invaded Georgia and NATO did absolutely nothing. That statement proved as useless as Ned Stark's piece of paper. If you get the reference, you get the reference. Dave Smith talked about Zelensky turning down a peace deal at the behest of the United States.
From very solid reporting that actually America, through Boris Johnson, told Ukraine not to negotiate with Russia at the very beginning of the war, when they had a deal worked out. They had a deal worked out. There's been reported in multiple sources that they had a deal worked out, and the deal was basically that Vladimir Putin would pull back. He would pull back his troops and leave Ukraine under the condition that the very simple conditions that Ukraine guaranteed autonomy for the Donbass region and agreed to never join NATO. And like that was a deal. Like, okay, I'm not saying everyone thinks that's the perfect deal, but it's better than what we got right now.
It's better than nuclear war.
It's hard to say exactly what's been happening diplomatically, as most of it happens behind closed doors. But if reporting is to be believed, Boris Johnson wasn't alone in talking to Zelensky before the war. Apparently, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, another friend of America, told Zelensky he should take a peace deal. If it's true that Zelensky turned down a peace deal before the war, he apparently wasn't the only one. As Reuters reported last month, Vladimir Putin's chief envoy on Ukraine told the Russian leader as the war began that he had struck a provisional deal with Kyiv that would satisfy Russia's demand that Ukraine stay out of NATO, but Putin rejected it and pressed ahead with his military campaign. According to three people close to the Russian leadership, the Ukrainian-born envoy, Dmitry Kozak, told Putin that he believed the deal he had hammered out removed the need for Russia to pursue a large-scale occupation of Ukraine, according to these sources. It's also worth noting that, as long as Ukraine was fighting in its eastern separatist regions, and was disputing Russia's annexation of Crimea, NATO membership was out of the question, as the alliance doesn't absorb nations with ongoing military conflicts. Going back to Mearsheimer's lecture about how this is the West's fault, he does identify NATO expansion as a provocation, but he also lists EU expansion and democracy promotion as provocations as well. Neither of the latter two are military actions. We know that Putin did not want Ukraine in NATO, but given that Ukraine was nowhere near becoming a member, that Putin could have had that granted to him before the war, and given that Putin talked about Ukraine as if it was some lost appendage of Mother Russia, it's entirely possible this invasion would have happened irrespective of NATO expansion. We may never know. With all this considered, is it fair to say Russia was provoked? Sure, the same way the abused housewife provoked her husband into beating her after she didn't cook the meal right. It's only a provocation if the one supposedly being provoked is abusive and unreasonable, which is absolutely the case with Vladimir Putin and his 19th century view of geopolitics.